Good evening, everybody. My name is Todd Scholl. I serve as the lead learner for the South Carolina Education Association's Center for Educator Wellness and Learning. We call ourselves COOL, and you can find more information about COOL right there, cool.us. All of the live streams that we do, all of the great work that Dr. Marcella Wine-Snyder and our COOL coaches are doing, all available on the COOL website. And we hope that you'll check out that website to learn more. Before we get started tonight, there is something that's important that's come up that we'd like you to take action on. And that is House Bill 4624, which is the bill that would force educators to out their trans students and also ban gender-affirming care for people under 18. If you're interested in speaking out about that and telling folks that you'd like them to oppose that bill, you can go to the scea.org/H4624. Again, that's the scea.org/H4624. Tonight is, to me, a very important topic. And I know some people are wondering, why are we talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on a COOL live stream? To me, it is essential that we not be scared to have difficult conversations and bring up controversial topics in our classrooms. If we're going to prepare young people to be citizens in the world as they grow up, we need them to be able to, first of all, understand what's happening geopolitically, but also be able to discuss those things and be able to sometimes disagree and figure out how to disagree in a way that's respectful, that's also constructive, that's open-minded. And so I really think it's important for us to be equipped as educators when it comes to these really important global issues. And at NEA recently, the board just approved a statement saying that they're calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. And I think no matter where you are in terms of how you view this, I would hope that we all are pulling for peace. We also don't like to see innocent people being killed. You know, seeing these images of children and innocent folks being killed and losing their homes is really heartbreaking. And so I knew myself, as this conflict unfolded, that I didn't know enough. I only had a surface level understanding. And so I started to do research because I didn't want to start sharing opinions without them being informed. And so after I did some of that research, I realized I wanted more, and I wanted to share some of that information with you. So I reached out to a former student of mine named Teddy Carfolite, who I knew had studied issues in the Middle East in college. And he recommended the other guest tonight, Tyler Scheineman. And so Teddy is currently teaching world history, economics, and AP human geography at Heathwood Hall Episcopal School in Columbia. He worked in Richland County School District 1 and Bamberg County School District 2, where he taught U.S. history, economics, AP world history, AP human geography, and AP seminar. He spent many summers working to develop a geography curriculum focused on making complex political and social issues accessible to high school students. He has a BA in religious studies and an MAT, both from the University of South Carolina. You can go Gamecocks. So I felt like he can kind of help us with the how do we bring this to students appropriately piece. And then Tyler Scheineman, who's an assistant professor of environmental and sustainable studies at Keene State College, who has a PhD in political science from UMass Amherst, a master's degree from the University of Toronto, has studied at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem as an exchange student, where he had the chance to learn about the conflict from both Israeli and Palestinian scholars, activists, and everyday people. His research examines environmental policy and activism in the United States and the Middle East. He spent about 2 years of his life in the Middle East with the support of a Fulbright fellowship and 2 critical language scholarships for Arabic from the U.S. State Department. So enough talking from me. Let's bring on Teddy and Tyler for this conversation tonight. How are you doing tonight?
Doing well, Todd. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
Is there anything that I missed from your bios that you want to share with viewers?
I I've got a dog snoring in front of me. That's in my life right now.
Yes, and Teddy, you have a glorious beard, so I think you need to
add that to the bio.
Yeah, add that to the bio. Let's. This is a serious subject, and it's one that I think a lot of people are afraid to talk about. I know at first I was kind of afraid to share any opinions about it because I felt like someone's going to. I don't know. I felt like I was going to say the wrong thing. So I think a lot of times people just ignore it, just say, "Well, I just won't talk about it at all." Let's start off with a basic sort of primer on what's happening, and I'll pass that to you, Tyler. What exactly is happening? What is the state of the current struggle and where it came from?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's hard to talk about. A lot of terrible stuff has happened and is continuing to happen. I mean, I'm sure most of you are aware that things in Israel and Palestine haven't been great for quite a while. This is a long-running conflict that goes back, many decades, if not a century. But lately, since October 7th of last year, there's been what it typically is called like a new cycle of violence. One attack spurs another attack, and so the human toll has really escalated. So for those of you who feel like you might be out of the loop or need a little refresher, so back in early October of last year, there was an attack in Israel orchestrated by a group called Hamas. And they killed about 1,400 Israelis, most of them civilians, and took a couple hundred people hostage. And there is a significant amount of those hostages that are still being held. A lot of women, children, elderly, reports of torture, even sexual assault that are being investigated right now. Hamas claimed that it attacked Israel because Israel has been holding the Gaza Strip, which is the territory that Hamas controls. It's been holding that territory under a blockade, so it limits what can go in and go out, which has had a really devastating impact on the economy there. It also points to the fact that Israel has been illegally occupying with its military the West Bank, which is another piece of Palestinian territory. So, it saw this as a kind of military tactic in this kind of long-running conflict. And the attack was really devastating to Israel. It's the most deadly attack in Israel's history. It's often compared to Israel's 9/11, not just in terms of the destruction, but the kind of the psychic impact that it's had on the population. A lot of Israelis have fled their homes away from the borders because there's also rockets that have been coming in over the borders, both in the north and in the south. So Israelis are very scared and angry. They want the hostages back. They want to feel safe in their own country. And in response to this attack, the Israeli military has launched a really devastating and deadly attack on not just Hamas, but on the entire population of the Gaza Strip, and more recently, even attacks within the West Bank, which is a kind of separate territory controlled by Palestinians. So this is a very, it's a really hard news to watch, because every day you hear reports of more and more innocent civilians being killed in Gaza. Right now, the death toll is over 29,000 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip and counting. And most of the people in that small piece of land, it's a very tiny piece of land, and we're talking about around 2 million, slightly under 2 million people. Most of those people have been forced to flee their homes. And so you have all of these people just running for their lives, trying to find a safe place, but there really isn't any place to go. They're really kind of penned in. They're not able to escape over the border. And so a lot of people are dying. And there's now shortages of clean water, of clean food, of medicine. doctors are conducting surgeries and cesarean sections without anesthesia because of these blocks of aid. And because of that, a lot of experts are warning that the death toll might begin to spike, not just because of the bombings, but also because of famine and disease that's going to be spreading because of the unclean water. So yeah, I mean, the devastation in Gaza is so large now that Israel is being accused of committing a genocide in the International Court of Justice right now. And it's defending itself, saying it's not actually a genocide. That's something that's being investigated currently. But regardless of what we call it, we know that tens of thousands of innocent civilians are being killed, and more will die before this is over. And the conflict is actually spreading outside of that territory. So there's been attacks in the West Bank, as I mentioned. There's been attacks in Lebanon, in the Red Sea, in Jordan. We just had 3 American soldiers killed in an attack in Jordan because the allies of Hamas are starting to get involved in the conflict. So things are spiraling right now, and we're probably going to see a lot more death and destruction before anything gets better, I'm sad to say.
Thank you for that, Tyler. Teddy, I wanted you to, how can, if you're an educator and it's appropriate, I imagine this is not necessarily an appropriate conversation at the kindergarten level, but with an AP history class or world geography class, where this would be an appropriate conversation, how does an educator take a really difficult subject like this and bring it into a classroom, especially if you have really strong personal opinions about this? How do you appropriately bring this in and open it up to discussion, especially when you may have Jewish students, and you may have students maybe who have family or relatives in the Middle East? How do you do that?
Yeah, and I'm lucky enough to teach students that are Jewish students, students from Egypt, who definitely have really strong opinions. And then Americans that find themselves really strong opinions sometimes. And the first thing, whether it be any sort of divisive issue, if you have a hard emotional response to it, I always ask my students to kind of take a step back and try and figure out why that is. Why did you automatically decide that you were on this side of whatever conflict that we're talking about? And what do you think led you to get there? What kind of forces is it? I mean, maybe it really is an educated opinion. It's something that you've surrounded yourself with, you've done research, or it's something you've experienced yourself. But especially when a student hasn't had a lot of direct experience or research, I always like to ask them to stop and kind of think hey, why have I decided that this group is wrong and this group is right? Especially if they're viewing it from a standpoint of like black and white. If it's not gray at all, guys, there's a problem. Regardless of what the issue is, it could be Democrats, Republicans, right? No matter what it is, if there's no gray for you, then you need to take a step back and think about it for a second. And I find that to be helpful. We also I think it's really important to just talk about what our expectations are of human rights. Take a step back away from regardless of race, creed, whatever, nationality, human rights wise, what are your expectations? What do you hold your government to? What do you hold other governments to when you're traveling? And I think that is helpful too, just so kids can have a baseline for how to view conflict. And right and wrong is something that's always been difficult to get people to agree on. But when we talk about human rights, everyone has an idea of how they want to be treated and how they want what they expect for their own family. And that helps too, I think. And it can make it a little bit less divisive. There's a quote from a Nigerian author, which I've got on my screen real quick. If you want to,
yeah, give me a second. There we
go. And it's Chimamanda Adichie wrote Purple Hibiscus, which is a great novel. And she gave a TED talk 15 years ago, and it's probably one that if it was a vinyl, it'd be worn out from me. But the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And any time that I start like my culture unit in AP Human Geography, we'll take 10 minutes and watch her TED Talk. And it really does just talk about how easy it can be to turn, you know, actions of an organization like Hamas or legislation passed by a political party and like decide that that is the actions, or that is the whole of the people, you know, like,
right.
And I think that's the most important thing that I can do as an educator is, you know, if I have students who are, you know, that they're going to sit down and they're willing to learn the complexities of, you know, the shattered belt that is Israel and Palestine, that's great. But if I can get students to be like, you know, to think about human rights and to, you know, to slow down and to not, you know, jump to conclusions when they're learning about a conflict, then I've done my job. Right. If they learn about what a proxy war is too, that's great. Right. But that's way less important because this is something that they can apply in their daily lives. Because they're going to encounter conflict, local conflict in their own community, national conflict. And some of them might not ever, you know, visit the Middle East. Some of them might not meet somebody from the Middle East. Get to the Middle East in our class. But I think that's the big lesson for me. But SE educators are asked to do a lot more than that. Some of our standards, like we have standards that look at like the 6th grade. It's a causation standard, and it asks students to promote inquiry into genocide, including the Holocaust, as well as the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ensuing conflict that resulted from the creation of the State of Israel. And I cannot imagine, I've never taught 6th grade, but I cannot imagine trying to address this with 6th graders. But I would hope that maybe I would slow down and kind of go about it the way that I just talked about. Like, these are different groups. They have extremely different ideas of how this land should be used. They have very different claims. But most importantly, like, they're people. And like, you know, there have been various times when their human rights have been stripped. And like, we can agree that that's not okay. Even like you're not going to solve Camp David. It's not going to happen in a 6th grade classroom. Camp David didn't happen, right? Like, so like Oslo too, not so hot either. But like they need to learn the humanity of what's going on around them, and like that's the priority as an educator for me. Yeah,
that's really great advice. Before we segue into because I know, Tyler, I read through the notes, and I do want to talk about the stereotype piece that you're included in some of tonight's discussion, because I think that's a really important piece here in America, is talking about some of the stereotypes and dispelling that. But I want to kind of close a little bit of the loop on this current situation with something that just happened recently, and that is the United States vetoed the UN call for ceasefire. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the United Nations is this club that most countries are in, and inside of that club, there's kind of like the elite room where just a few countries basically get a veto vote, where they get to say no matter what the tally is for the rest of the world. If one of those countries vetoes it, then it's done. And there's just a couple of countries that have that kind of power, and the United States is one of them. And it once again used that veto vote to block a UN resolution that would put pressure on Israel to, in this case, abide by a ceasefire. And that's really part of a larger pattern where the United States has historically used that veto power in the United Nations to protect Israel, because it sees Israel as an ally. And so regardless of what the rest of the world has to say, Israel is usually kind of protected from that international diplomatic pressure, because the United States is kind of a big brother figure there that can kind of stick up for Israel using that veto.
And I think this is important too, the context domestically of what kind of impact this could have on the upcoming election. There is just objectively, there is there are people on the left who are increasingly frustrated with the Biden administration's stance on this and continued support for the operations in Gaza, and then this veto. I think what's happening is you're seeing a lot of people, progressives in America, get increasingly frustrated with Biden, and I think if you are a Democrat, perhaps one of the concerns is that some of those people are going to stay home or maybe vote for a Cornel West or a Jill Stein in next November, and that could be enough to swing the vote to whoever the Republican nominee, presumably Trump, but whoever that is. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So it's, I mean, in terms of the broad history, you know, since the 1960s, the United States, whether it's a Democrat or Republican in office, the United States has worked very closely with Israel, sending it a lot of financial aid, military aid, and then, as we mentioned, those veto votes in the UN. And it's really been a kind of bipartisan thing. Most of the Republican Party is united around this idea of supporting Israel for, you know, because it's a popular idea among evangelical Christians, and they tend to move towards the Republican camp. So their constituency is kind of generally locked into that kind of perspective. The Democratic Party has been a little bit more of a kind of a big umbrella, like a big tent that has a lot of different types of groups inside of it. And some of those groups are very sympathetic to Israel. Some of them are outright Zionists, in the sense like Zionism is just this idea that Israel should be a country for Jews. It's basically Jewish nationalism, and I'm happy to explain that more if that is confusing for the moment. But the Democratic Party is a mix, and some people within the Democratic Party have been looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from more of a human rights perspective, and therefore have been quite upset that we're sending so much money and military aid to a country that uses it to do things that violate human rights, violate the human rights of Palestinians. And so there has been this like kind of like long-running vein within the Democratic Party that's been critical of Israel, but they haven't had a really big impact on the policy because they are not as loud and well funded as the Israel lobby is in the United States. What's happening right now with the Biden administration, from a historical perspective, is very interesting because he is showing signs of trying to move away from a kind of unconditional support of Israel, which is something that most presidents have flirted with in more extreme moments, but then kind of failed to follow through with. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen, but I know that Biden is looking at, you know, Michigan, which has a large population of Arab and Muslim Americans who feel strongly about this issue, and he's worried about losing Michigan, those electoral votes. So unfortunately, like our politicians, they often make decisions according to what's going to get them reelected, not necessarily what's going to save the most human lives.
Right.
And so that's definitely part of his calculus now in terms of trying to keep the Democratic Party united behind him, make sure everybody turns out to vote for him when the election comes forward. And if he alienates too many of these voters who feel like it's not worth it, or they're just too upset that they don't want to, you know, sacrifice their principles to vote for him, we could see him lose the election.
Teddy, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I do think it presents the opportunity to talk to kids about, like, especially in a high school classroom, about like what a lobby is, and how lobbies don't always like the NRA does not represent the thoughts of most gun owners anymore. It presents like an opportunity to discuss how these very small niche groups can sink their teeth in specific places and have a disproportionate amount of control based off of the American populace or people who share that value of that lobby. And I've I've had AIPAC on a list of those lobbies, and for a long time when I taught American government, is one that I would bring up as a lobby that had a lot of power and kind of got its funding from a source that most Americans wouldn't predict, that it comes from right-wing Christians that help fund an organization that helps promote Israeli interest in U.S. government. So just like as an example of the complexity of our government.
Yeah. One thing that will often happen, just to kind of keep it on the topic of the electoral politics. So AIPAC, the organization that Teddy just mentioned, it's a very well-funded lobby in DC. And one thing that they'll do is, if they think a politician is too outspoken against Israel, is they'll try and fund somebody else to run against them in the primary, for example. And so this, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But if you're a politician and you're deciding which battles you want to fight, it makes fighting the battle about Israel less attractive, right? Because you don't want to kick that hornet's nest, because then all of a sudden you get these well-funded organizations coming after you and making it harder for you to get reelected.
Yeah. I want to shift gears to going to a further back in history to understand the context, because I think we've done a pretty good job of outlining what's happening now and sort of the issues happening currently. But there's, as always, the issues are complex and require us to examine the dots that led us to here. And one of the things that I think happens in America is an oversimplification of the conflicts that happen in the Middle East, as though we kind of lump them all into one category. I remember as a child, we had the hostages in Iran as there was the Islamic Revolution. You had the war in Iraq, the first one, then you had the second war in Iraq, you had 9/11 and all these things. And everybody just wants to lump it all as there's this big problem in the Middle East, and think about it, that it's, as you said, that it's primordial or ancient, that it's always been this way. And as you stated in the notes, that it's a relatively new political problem. This particular one is relatively new. And can you talk a little bit, Tyler, about the historical context for this, and also tie that into how we tend to, in America, stereotype and oversimplify things and people in the Middle East?
Sure. Yeah. I think that, you put it quite well. I think that the overarching stereotype of the Middle East, it's certainly the one that I grew up on when, whether it's watching Aladdin or all the action movies that, in my family, we didn't really all share a taste in movies, but one genre that we all enjoyed were action movies. And when I grew up, in the 90s on, Arnold Schwarzenegger and all that kind of stuff, the bad guys were usually wearing a Palestinian kufiya.
Right.
They were Arab, they were terrorists. And then, as you watch the news about these real events, you see the Middle East as this place where people are killing each other, right? It looks like a region where people get hurt, right? And bad things happen. Like it's like almost like it's part of its DNA. And I think that stereotype of the region kind of misleads us into thinking that these problems, that what's happening right now in Israel-Palestine are just part of the region and it'll never change, that these things can't be fixed, right? And, I think that of all, Middle Eastern specialists who study the region, I think if there's one thing that they wish the public knew and kind of took away, is that it's not always been like this, and it doesn't have to be like this in the future. That this is a political problem largely driven by social movements and government policies, which means that it can be fixed by social movements and government policies, right? It's a myth that it has to be this way. It doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to fix, but yeah, a lot of this death and destruction is unnecessary. It's a consequence of political arrangements and decisions that people are making, and it's a problem that can be undone with the right amount of care and attention. Yeah, and I can talk more about some of those details in the historical context, but I think that if there's one thing that you take away from this chat, it's that it doesn't have to be this way, that there's a lot of people who are trying to help and make things better, and if there was more power behind them, I think that we could see some real change here.
Tyler, I definitely want you to do that. I want to segue into like the historical context of the current conflict. I think you have some slides that'll help people see that geographically and understand it better. Before we go there, I do want Teddy to comment on. So Teddy, like a lot of American kids grow up without knowing about, for example, how America intervened and the British Empire intervened in Iran in a way that kind of led to the Islamic Revolution, or how there was a conflation after 9/11 with Saddam Hussein and the people who committed 9/11. So there tends to be this sort of lack of connection or understanding. And I feel like sometimes if you want to bring that into a classroom and just talk about, these are the historical facts, these are the historical things that happened, that sometimes people want to then say, well, you're pushing an agenda, you're an anti-American, you're not, or whatever. And I think that is what gets us to continue to repeat some of the same mistakes, because we're not really confronting the reality of things, whether you think they were mistakes or not. Like it's helpful to understand. Like I read, reading Persepolis is helpful. I think it would be a helpful thing for young people to read, to understand, or reading The Kite Runner or A Thousand Splendid Suns about Afghanistan, like helping to understand what the people on the ground have been through in terms of leadership changes and the insertion of Western powers by installing puppet regimes and things like that. How do we do that? How do we do that in a public school classroom?
So like you just look for patterns. One of my favorite things to do as a geography teacher is to pull up borders. Like, hey, let's talk about this border here between South Carolina and Georgia. Or like, all right. And like some of the kids are like, oh, that's the Savannah River. Like they know right off the bat, it's a natural border. It occurs for this reason. Let's go looking for some borders that don't look natural at all. Take 5 minutes. Let's go look for some borders that don't make sense. All right. And you've got like Namibia with this weird arm jutted out where it's supposed to be able to grab the Zambezi. Like, well, no one who lived there would have made that border happen. Like, where else do you see them? And then it gives you the opportunity to talk about other outside factors that are going to make political decisions that are going to affect cultural groups that live in these places. It doesn't matter, like these places that have been colonized by European powers or have experienced a lot of Western meddling. And at that point, it's just like the kid is coming to the assumption, like they're getting there by doing the problem solving that we are supposed to encourage as teachers. And I'm sure someone will argue with me one day, but no one has yet. And I'm not taking a side. I'm just trying to look for some patterns. And then next, let's look at a map where we see, ethnic conflict, and how often those pop up in areas where borders were not drawn organically, where borders were superimposed. And I think that's like you almost have to treat it like you would anything else while being aware of how sensitive it is. If that makes sense. Like you use the same teaching methods while recognizing that there could be this visceral response.
Yeah. And I think it's scary to think about that seems to be a growing movement to sort of edit or censor the teaching of truth, of the historical truth, so that it fits into whatever particular ideology a particular group wants to promote. And if your teaching starts to get students to connect those dots, that it's all of a sudden like you're indoctrinating kids. And it's like, that's to me, a really scary way to confront history, is to let's filter it so that it makes us always look like the good guys, because then it turns from history to propaganda. And that's obviously problematic. Tyler, you had some slides you wanted to share with us. I think it would be helpful to just now kind of transition into what was some of the historic history that led to the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll just say that this is obviously going to be a smaller version of the story. What we're seeing that's going on right now today is really the latest chapter in a very, very, very big book. I don't think the conflict is actually all that complicated. Like the plot of the conflict is largely about who's going to control the land, who gets to have a state, and who doesn't. But the conflict can look confusing to outsiders because it's been going on for a long time. So there's lots of events and there's lots of characters involved. And so that can be intimidating and maybe make you as a teacher not feel comfortable addressing it in class because maybe you don't have your head wrapped around this whole book. But really the plot isn't all that complicated. So my goal here is not really to go through every event, but just to help you understand the plot. And I think the easiest place to start is a kind of, I think historically, like I like my origin stories. And so a good starting place to go back to is to look at maps of what the region looked like before these borders were formed. This was a region that was largely under the control of the Ottoman Empire, which was a time period up until World War I. And in what is now Israel and Palestine, you had Muslims, Christians, and a small population of Jews, about, I think, 6,000 Jews, mostly living in Jerusalem and Hebron. And they lived together, right? There weren't clashes between them over religious or ethnic lines. That this was really a period of coexistence. And what interrupted that coexistence was largely this idea that, in place of this big empire, we're going to establish states with borders. And that leads to the question, okay, like who gets a state and who's going to be in charge of it? Yeah, sure, I can make that big. Thanks for asking.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah, appreciate it. I hope that helps. But I now can't see you guys, so I'll
go to full screen. Let me see if we can.
Oh, okay.
On our end, it didn't go to full screen.
Oh, okay.
Let me try it. Let me see again.
Maybe it would just help to zoom into the
that might help.
Yeah.
Yeah, that looks
great.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Okay.
So I think this is a good moment. If there's a couple of technical terms I can leave you with understanding, this idea of nationalism. I mean, obviously you've heard of this term, but when we talk about it in history and in political science, what it refers to is the idea that as a people, you need your own country. You need your own state with borders around it, with your own military to defend it, right? It's an idea that caught on in the 1800s, largely among groups that felt themselves being discriminated against by the governments that they lived inside of, right? So, an example that might be closer to home would be, think of the struggle for Black equality in the United States, right? There were kind of two different versions of that struggle. One was the version that I think most of us are familiar with the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King. It was this idea that African Americans would achieve security and fulfilling and safety and equality by being treated as equal citizens, right? By being treated as Americans according to what the Constitution, guarantees them as their civil rights, right? That was a movement to kind of as a kind of integrative movement, this idea that African Americans are Americans and deserve to be treated as such. An alternative version of Black liberation was this idea of Black nationalism, which is the notion that African Americans will never be safe inside of America. They will never be treated as equals. And so it's best if they actually had their own society, their own country, their own state, where they will rule themselves and they can defend themselves within their own borders. This was the notion of Black nationalism. It had many different versions of itself, but that's something that we saw happen in America, right? A minority that saw itself being mistreated. Indeed, it was being mistreated. And this idea of nationalism, this idea that we can be safer and live better lives if only we had our own country. This is what nationalism is. And we see this sprouting up in the Middle East region in the 1800s. And it was largely in response to, on behalf of Jews, for example, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe. I mean, this is even before the Holocaust, right? A lot of Jews are being discriminated against. They're being killed for being Jewish. And this idea of nationalism that's kind of catching on. It's like this kind of like meme that's being informing people of how they want to pursue their justice for their community, right? This idea that, well, maybe we just need our own country, right? This is where the Zionist movement came from. That Zionism is Jewish nationalism. It's the idea that in order to be safe from anti-Semitism, we Jews need our own country, right? So that we have our own borders, we have our own military to defend ourselves. And so, the diaspora of Jews that are spread all around the world need to come together and move to a chunk of territory and establish their own state there, right? That was the Zionist movement. And it sprouted up in the late 1800s, and it didn't catch on. Not all Jews were on board. In fact, it was very controversial and still is controversial among Jews to this day. Not all Jews support this idea. But it was the idea that in order to protect Jews from anti-Semitism, Jews need their own state. And at the same time that was happening, another group was also thinking that, they're being discriminated against. The Arabs in the Ottoman Empire felt that they were being mistreated by the Ottomans and later by the British that came in and took over after World War I. And so a lot of Arabs were demanding their own state, their own territory to be ruled over by themselves, self-rule. And so one version of this was the Palestinian nationalist movement, this idea that the people on this territory called Palestine deserve their own country. And so what ends up happening really is that there's a fight over who gets to have this territory. A lot of Jews are moving to the region, trying to take over and make this their state, right? But the problem, of course, is that there's an indigenous population there, the Palestinians, and they want their own state. And so you have these two groups of people, these two nationalist movements fighting over the same piece of territory. And, the Zionist movement was successful in establishing their own state there. And the Palestinians to this day have failed to accomplish that goal yet.
And what was the role, forgive me for interrupting, what was the goal of the British or America in the establishment in that Zionist sort of winning out that sort of confrontation?
Yeah. So long story short, the British basically were promising both groups that they would have a state in the future. But they really washed their hands. They never really finished their plan. They basically got frustrated over the whole situation and just left. Like, they were in charge of Palestine. They were the colonial kind of powers in the area. And they were basically getting shot at by the Jews and the Palestinians in the area, both of whom wanted the British out because they were a colonial power. And so the British just kind of washed their hands of the whole thing and walked away. The United Nations did try to step in.
Is that similar to kind of what happened in India when they left India, and then the Muslims and Hindus kind of fought over, and then we had the establishment of Pakistan, and India as the Hindu place and the Pakistan as the place for Islamic people, and then they sort of separated themselves. Is there some parallel? Are there some parallels there?
The parallel is that instead of these things getting sorted out according to maybe some principles about, self-rule and everybody having the same rights and everybody's lives matter and they deserve equal consideration, a lot of this just got sorted out through power politics, right? So maybe it would help to show you these two images here. So this map here on the left was a map drawn up by the United Nations
Yeah,
And this was the United Nations proposal about what should happen, right? So when the British walked away and gave up, the United Nations said, okay, let's make two states here, one for the Israelis, one for the Palestinians. And Jerusalem, the city that everybody wants because it has all these important religious sites, nobody gets Jerusalem. It'll be an international city. It'll have a mayor who works through the United Nations, but everybody gets their own state here. That was the proposal. And this proposal was rejected. It was accepted by the Israelis because it was a really good deal for them because they were getting a lot of the land. They didn't have a lot of people there, but they were getting a kind of a disproportionate amount of the land. So it was a really good deal for them. But it was, and for the same reason, the locals, the Palestinians, did not like this. They saw this was, a very unfair distribution of the land, and so they rejected it. And so instead of having further negotiations, there was just a war, right? The Israelis declared independence, the Arabs declared war, and there was a fight. And the borders that we largely end up with, and I'll scroll over here to this map, this is what we end up getting in practice, right? These borders were drawn up basically like when the ceasefire was declared, where were the battle lines?
And what year are we talking here? What year is this?
This is 49.
Okay.
Yeah,
yep.
the ceasefire was 49. The fighting happened largely in 48.
Okay.
Yeah. And once you see this map, you can kind of see what modern day Israel and Palestine. You can kind of see the outline of the West Bank here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's that kind of kidney bean shaped piece of land.
With Ramallah in the middle.
Yeah, with Ramallah in the middle, around Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And then down to the left, you see that little kind of finger-shaped plot of land. That what became the Gaza Strip.
Gotcha.
And so you get these borders, but you also get the emergence of Palestinian refugees, right? So a lot of the people in the Gaza Strip today are refugees from this conflict because when the Israelis moved in and took land with their military very effectively, they committed a lot of atrocities. There was a lot of ethnic cleansing, and word got around, and Palestinians fled for their lives, thinking that they would be back, in a week or so when the fighting stopped. And so they fled to places like Gaza and the West Bank as refugees, and they've been there ever since, living as refugees, generations after generations.
Something that I think is important if you're a teacher, especially if you're a social studies teacher watching this, when we look at Gaza, we can tell it's small. I don't think people understand how small. It's like 1/3 of LA or like 2 Washington DCs with 2 million people. So when you hear on the news, if your students are asking you, like why don't they just get away from the fighting? Why can't they move away from the invasion? We're in the United States. We have, just the surplus of land. We can't imagine not being able to get away from something like this. And just how trapped people are in Gaza. Like, and that map pops up and it's instantly like in my chest. That's what I think about. And it's something that I think people who don't understand the conflict, was after the invasion of Iraq, it was still a ridiculous amount of Americans couldn't find Iraq on a map.
Right.
That's just something that I don't think most Americans realize, and our students definitely don't. It's just what a small piece of land that 2 million people. I think It Was Time did a great job of showing the population density in Gaza a couple weeks ago. And there's 1 or 2 metro centers in the world that have greater population densities than Gaza as a whole.
And they can't go. So they can't go to the sea. They can't go into Israel. So to the south there, for those who can't see that, is Egypt, correct?
Yes.
So what is the issue with them going to Egypt?
The Egyptians do not want to open up their border because they don't want the Palestinians coming into their country. Egypt has, especially the current regime in Egypt, has a very hostile relationship with the Hamas government in the Gaza Strip. And, like a lot of the other Middle Eastern countries, Palestinians are seen as a nuisance. They don't want them there. They see them as troublemakers because they're involved in a conflict with Israel, and they don't want that conflict coming into their country. Gotcha. Unfortunately. So the Palestinians are they're mistreated by a lot of governments in the region, not just the Israelis. But they would tell you that they don't want to go to Egypt, right? That they do not want to be pushed out of the Gaza Strip because they don't believe they'll be let back in, right? This is, to them, this is just the latest chapter of ethnic cleansing, and they want to stay there, right? And a lot of them have family that are trapped in the north. So that's another reason why a lot of Palestinians are unwilling to leave, is because they're worried about leaving their family members behind.
So then moving forward in time,
sure.
How did this map continue to evolve?
Yeah, so there's lots of events and stages and chapters that are important, but I'll skip through them and just show you what the current map really looks like here. So what we see here, and I'm sorry, I'm zooming out a bit more. You can see the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and these white territories on the map are what can be called little pockets of where Palestinians can exercise some kind of self-rule. But for the most part, Israel controls the lives of Palestinians. The West Bank, a good chunk of it is being militarily occupied by the Israeli military, and now the Gaza Strip, of course, is being invaded and militarily occupied as well. And so what ends up happening is you get a lot of Palestinians being ruled over by the Israeli military, right? And as you can probably imagine, they're not exactly being treated as equals with human rights. This is why Israel is often accused of being an apartheid state, right? Because in practice, the Palestinians are being governed by the Israelis, and under their law, they do not have the same rights as Israelis.
Right. So that obviously for those watching, you can see that the territory that they had has continued to shrink, and this partially has to do with settling the settlers that have continued to encroach on what has been what we call the West Bank. There's been just encroachment in terms of Israeli settlers. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a combination of the settlers, which for those of you who are scratching your heads, the settlers are Israeli citizens who believe that this is their land to take. And so they deliberately go and they try to push Palestinians off their land by building houses and even suburbs with the help of the Israeli government under the protection of the Israeli military, to try and take as much land as possible, to try and make life very difficult for the Palestinians. They want to push them out. It's a very kind of a war of attrition in some of those ways. So part of this is the settlements that are being built there, and the other part is just the Israeli military declaring areas just off limits to the Palestinians. So in the easternmost side of the West Bank, the Jordan River Valley, a lot of that is just a big military zone that the Israeli government controls. When I was there, I stayed with a Palestinian family in the Jordan River Valley, and they were not allowed to build houses on their own farmland because the Israeli military would not give them permits to do so. And so when I was there, they had a young man who, he was I think a 25-year-old. He just had gotten married and he was having a kid. And so they wanted to build another little house for him next to his parents' house so he could live with his parents and with his kids in this separate house. And it was demolished by an Israeli bulldozer because the Israelis, they were just trying to make life for these Palestinians as miserable as possible so that they will leave, right? They're trying to nudge them out.
Teddy, how do you when you bring this kind of content into a classroom, and you're wanting to do it as sensitively as possible, because you're not wanting to create anti-Semitism, you're also not wanting to create, animus towards Palestinian people or to people who are Muslim. What would be your advice to teachers who are scared about that, of being labeled an anti-Semite or labeled a Islamophobe or whatever? What would be your advice to them?
So with high schoolers, and hopefully, like we can talk about like humanity and some of these more basic issues, but I hope that 8th grade and elementary school teachers are not being asked to do this despite what our state standards might require. But with high school students, first of all, I asked, like, we separate what it means to be like what anti-Semitism is from what like the state of Israel is, or what it is to be Jewish. Again, like that single story. Like, you never want to paint every Jewish person as a Zionist. You don't want to paint every Zionist as anti-Palestinian. Like there's, you know, there's going to be levels to all of this. And like, there's moderates within the Israeli government. There's progressives within the Israeli government. There are radicals within the Israeli government. But one of the things is you want to vary what you're teaching. You want to, if you keep on going back to the same subject matter, if every time that I taught modern colonization or human rights, if I went straight to Israel every time, that would be a problem, right? If in South Carolina standards, I think, are better than some others, but still we see a lot of state standards where whenever we talk about like ethnic cleansing or genocide, sometimes they'll only mention 1 or 2 conflicts when we know that's not the case.
Right.
So like when I teach ethnic cleansing or genocide in AP Human Geography, which I have to, I'll teach about Namibia. I'll teach about Cambodia. I'll teach about Kristallnacht. Like there's a wide variety of examples that you can pull from, and then make connections. You know, you have if Palestinians are unable to conduct business and they're unable to trade because of roads that have been created to connect settlements, how different is that than white Southerners who wanted our governments to stay white-led in the United States going after Black-owned businesses, which were the first, targets in the early 20th century when there started to be some Black economic success. In the 1920s and 30s, those were the first targets. It was, a lot of the white nationalists were fine as long as you weren't a successful, Black Southerner economically. And that's what I kind of try and make those parallels. And don't spend too much time on one. Like, just pragmatically, don't spend too much time on one, or you will be accused. And maybe I don't want the social studies teacher or the history teacher who spends 7 weeks on the Civil War. Regardless, like that's not good practice. You want to vary things up, but you want to make it so kids can make connections to a variety of conflicts in a world history or in a geography class. They're going to be better world citizens if you do that, and there's gonna be more critical thinking going on.
Yeah, and I always wanted it to be alive too. Like I just felt like what's happening now.
Mm-hmm.
So when we were on our way to war, it was clear that we were on the way to war with Iraq back in 2002. That's when we had the students and teachers debate whether or not we should do that. We had that conversation. Talking about the pros and cons and what people felt like they knew about what was happening in Iraq with weapons of mass destruction and so forth. Like it's I think that is, like, your point is really great, that not just focusing on one conflict over and over again, but also looking at what the landscape of what's happening now so that you can make it relevant to what they're seeing in the news and what they're hearing about. But also not being tied to just that, and making the connections to multiple things throughout history that connect to the current events. I want to give you both just one last. We've run out of time. It's been an amazing conversation, and I'm sure we could go on for a couple more hours. But I do want to honor the time. Is Tyler and Teddy, anything that we didn't cover that you feel like is essential for our viewers to know, or that you wanted to share before we close out tonight?
I have something, but Teddy, do you want to jump in? I don't want to step on you.
Oh, no, just the one thing I would say is that, like teachers, when you do feel like you've been pressed by administration or by like a parent, and you're having that moment where you get that email, and you have that feeling in your gut, but to reach out to your network, and don't respond quickly. Reach out to your network, whether it be like if you're a SCEA member or if you're a part of another professional organization. and seek advice from your peers. Because one, it probably isn't as bad as it is, as you think it is. And two, someone else has probably dealt with a similar issue and might have some advice on how to get you through it. I've been on both sides, not with this issue, but I've had people reach out to me when they were, accused of teaching CRT type stuff. We slowed down and it was okay. And then early on in my career, I remember dealing with some issues and having to navigate some stuff with parents. And I was really glad that like my department head and her friend at another school could sit down with me and help me navigate it. So teachers, just kind of slow down and reach out to your network and, whatever that looks like.
Good advice. Tyler?
Sure. I guess what I would say to all the teachers in the room who might feel like they want to address this, but they're nervous about maybe getting it wrong. They're intimidated by the subject because it feels complex and controversial. I just want to encourage you that I think the most important thing is not to get every bit of the history right or have the perfect analysis. I think as long as you're modeling for the students a certain way of thinking, of asking questions, about paying attention to how we're connected to the wider world, that we should care about people in other countries, that our stories are connected to theirs, that kind of habit of thinking like a global citizen, as you demonstrate that to them, you're teaching them a really important lesson that these are questions worth asking, and these are admirable habits to have. And, they're going to learn from that. Even if they don't remember, like that little history lesson I gave you, like, even if they don't remember any of the content, they're going to learn that it's the right thing to do, to be asking these questions and to be paying attention, as long as you model that for them, right? They learn how to empathize, who they should care about, by watching us, right? And if we're asking these questions, if we're engaging with the current events, then they will see that there's virtue in that. And so even if you don't feel like you can, knock the lesson out of the park, I really want to encourage you to continue to just try and get them to ask these questions, right? It's really the inquiry that you're trying to teach them, rather than just kind of some, bit of history.
That's brilliant. That's a great way to kind of wrap this up. And again, I'm thinking maybe we need to do a part 2 to this, because there's so much more that feel like is important for us to discuss. But I feel like that was a really good beginning point and a good starter point for people. Hopefully the folks watching this have that kind of curiosity, because that's really what that inquiry, that curiosity is what we need to instill in kids. And then they're going to learn the things. They're going to go out and seek sources and books and information, and you can help them kind of bring that together and make sure that those are credible sources, because that's the other piece of this that's really important, is not just to go to corporate news or to something on social media, but to really dig into the history and go to great sources of information, and then start to piece it all together and formulate your own ideas and opinions on it. But just really the key to me is stimulating that curiosity and that desire to want to know and to care about what happens to other human beings outside your own bubble. And that's really kind of where we need to lead kids. But thanks to both of you tonight, Teddy, Tyler, wonderful. I really, really appreciate both of you for your time tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for letting us share.
All right. That's Teddy Carfelite and Tyler Schoeneman. Really, really great conversation, and an important conversation. And I hope that teachers who are watching tonight, Emily was watching, and she says, thank you all so much for this. Extremely important information. We'd love to see a part 2. Well said, Todd. Oh, thank you. But seriously, educators, we can't shy away from controversial subjects. These are things that are happening in the real world, and our students need to think about these things. And we don't have to tell them what to think, but we do need to get them thinking about important things that are happening in the world that are affecting human lives. We have thousands of people being killed actively right now in Gaza, and many of them are children. We have thousands of children who are now are struggling to have access to basic humanitarian needs. This is something that we need to be aware of, and we need to be pressuring. You need to think about what you believe in, and then advocate for the kind of world that you want to be in. And for me, that's a world of peace and a world where children aren't being killed. on either side. And so that's what I want to advocate for. And one of the things that I sometimes do when I feel helpless in these situations is I start from myself. If I want to see peace in the world, can I create peace within myself? And so that's why, like, for me, mindfulness practices and wellness practices are really important, because I need to create peace in myself, and I need to create peace where I can locally. And then I can figure out what I can do in these situations where I feel helpless. I want to share a couple of things that we have coming up that I think that you might be interested in. One of those things is the Educator Mindfulness Retreat. This is the second retreat we're going to do this summer, June 26th to 28th. That's going to be in Old Fort, North Carolina. There is another one where we have one space left, same spot in June 12th through the 14th. If you're interested in that, go to cool.us/retreat. That's CEWL .us/retreat. Put that up there on the screen for you. And a couple of other things we have coming up next week. We have the Body Project with Audrey Calianos. She's a registered dietitian. She's going to be talking about body image and how sometimes we really struggle with how we view our bodies, and having a healthy idea about nutrition and exercise and how our bodies look. And she's going to be talking about that. This is the one that's special to me. My son, Colin Scholl, is a PhD student at UTEP, and he's going to be talking about bilingualism and cognition. And he's going to be talking to you about some of the stereotypes around bilingual students, and how we can work with bilingual students and actually tap into some of the resources that they have, and the cognitive capabilities that they have that we sometimes miss. I also want to remind you about our Cool Coaching program. This is an amazing program. Every induction teacher in South Carolina needs to know that they can get free one-on-one assistance with a veteran educator every Tuesday and Thursday night from 6 to 8 o'clock. All they have to do is go to cool.us/coaching, and they can receive that free help. Well, thank you for tuning in tonight. We hope that everybody who tuned in learned something. I certainly learned a lot. I want to thank Tyler Shaneman and Teddy Carfelite for their time tonight. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope that you all have a wonderful weekend. The final thing I want to mention, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you want to reach out to state leaders to oppose House Bill 4624, which would force educators to out students, trans students, and would also ban life-saving gender-affirming care. If you'd like to reach out about that, go to thescea.org/H4624. Thanks again for your time tonight, and I'll see you on the next live stream.